The dog came out of the blizzard alone. No owner, no leash. Just blood on his fur, ice on his paws, and one desperate look back toward the road behind him. 74-year-old widow Ruth Bennett had been quietly sheltering inside her home when, somehow, the dog chose her. She followed him into the storm, and what she found in the snow would change 3 lives forever. But that was only the beginning. The German Shepherd would later lead them to a place inside Ruth's house that no one had touched in 12 years. And hidden beneath it was something her late husband had left behind before the entire town turned against him. Something someone may have wanted buried forever. Every life carries a story, and every one of us deserves a place to share what lies within our hearts. You are here with Porchlight Stories, where every life is welcomed beneath the warm glow of the porch light. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartfelt story. Please stay with us until the very end. If today's story touches your heart, give the video a like and subscribe to support the channel. And if there is anything we could do better, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. And now, let's begin. By 4:30 p.m. on January 27, 2026, Silver Creek, Montana was disappearing beneath the worst blizzard the valley had seen in years. Snow swept sideways between the dark pines, swallowing fences, mailboxes, and whole stretches of county road within minutes. Wind gusts above 50 miles an hour rattled windows hard enough to shake old frames loose, while temperatures dropped towards single digits. Electricity had already failed across much of the northern end of town. The sheriff's office had closed the mountain roads, and even the county snowplows had been ordered back after visibility fell below 20 yards. Silver Creek was a small place tucked against the mountains, the kind of Montana town where everyone recognized everyone else's truck, and bad weather was usually treated as an inconvenience rather than a disaster. That afternoon, however, even lifelong residents were staying home. Caleb Morgan should have been doing the same. At 41, Caleb was a former U.S. Marine Staff Sergeant who had spent nearly 18 years learning how to remain useful when everything around him became chaotic. He stood 6'2", broad-shouldered and lean, with weathered hands, short dark brown hair, a narrow scar along the left side of his jaw, and gray-blue eyes that had once made younger Marines describe him as impossible to rattle. After leaving the service, Caleb had joined Gallatin Mountain Search and Rescue as a canine handler. The work suited him. Mountains obeyed no rank, storms respected no experience, and trapped people did not care about a man's past as long as he knew how to find them. Yet the man driving the weathered Ford F-250 toward Bozeman that afternoon was no longer quite the man his teammates remembered. Ranger sat in the passenger seat. The 6-year-old German Shepherd was a large black and tan male with a deep chest, strong shoulders, intelligent amber-brown eyes, and a tiny notch missing from the edge of his left ear from an old backcountry search. Before 7 weeks ago, Ranger had been the sort of working dog who greeted every mission as though someone had invented it solely for his entertainment. He loved climbing into helicopters, racing toward the sight of his search harness, and stealing Caleb's gloves whenever the team stopped long enough for him to get bored. Children adored him. Other handlers trusted him. Caleb understood him almost without commands. Then, 7 weeks earlier, Ranger had located a family buried after an avalanche north of Bozeman. Caleb, Ranger, and the rest of their team had worked until all 4 members of the family were pulled out alive. They should have been celebrating. Instead, the mountain released a second time. Mason Reed saw it first. Mason had been 39, compact and muscular, with sandy hair, a crooked grin, and a gift for finding humor in situations where everyone else had run out of it. He had worked beside Caleb for nearly a decade and had become closer than many blood relatives. Mason shouted once, lunged toward Caleb, and shoved him clear. The avalanche took Mason instead. Ranger saw him disappear beneath the snow. The dog dug until his paws bled before Caleb finally dragged him away so the rescuers could work safely. Mason never came home. Since that afternoon, Caleb rarely slept longer than 2 hours without waking to the sound of snow that existed only inside his head. Ranger had stopped playing. He no longer wandered more than a few yards from Caleb and became restless whenever Caleb disappeared behind a closed door. Gallatin Sar's team chief eventually did what Caleb would not do for himself. He placed Caleb on mandatory medical leave and temporarily removed Ranger from operational duty. Caleb needed psychological and medical clearance. Ranger needed a behavioral and field readiness reassessment. Until then, neither of them was going back onto a mountain. Caleb had intended to stay with his older sister in Bozeman for several days. He had watched the weather reports, convinced himself he could make it before the worst of the storm arrived, and discovered too late that Montana had little interest in his confidence. Snow hammered the windshield while the wipers struggled to clear it. Ranger watched every movement Caleb made. "Almost through it," Caleb muttered, though he was no longer certain whether he meant the road or something else. A violent gust struck the truck broadside. Caleb tightened his grip. The county road curved between a steep bank on one side and a shallow ditch lined with pines on the other. Fresh snow concealed a sheet of black ice underneath. The front tires touched it. The steering wheel suddenly became light in Caleb's hands. Training took over. He eased off the accelerator and turned into the skid. For 1 second, the Ford straightened. Then the rear tires lost traction. The truck slid sideways, dropped into the ditch, and struck a pine with a violent metallic crack. The airbag exploded against Caleb's chest. Glass burst across the cab. Ranger slammed against the side of the dashboard, then everything became still except for the storm. Ranger recovered first. A piece of broken glass had opened a shallow cut along his right front leg, but he could stand. He immediately turned toward Caleb. Caleb hung against the seatbelt, his head tilted forward, a thin line of blood running from his hairline toward one eyebrow. Ranger pushed his muzzle beneath Caleb's hand. No response. He whined, licked Caleb's cheek, then grabbed the sleeve of his winter jacket and pulled. Caleb's arm moved only because Ranger moved it. The dog barked once, then twice, louder each time. The wind swallowed every sound. Ranger climbed over the console and squeezed through the broken passenger window. Deep snow swallowed his paws. He took several steps and stopped. Caleb was behind him. Since Mason's death, leaving Caleb had become the one thing Ranger resisted above almost everything else. He turned back toward the broken truck, ears flattened, breathing hard. Then some older piece of training pushed through the fear. Ranger ran. The first house was less than 200 yards away. No lights showed through the windows. Ranger scratched at the door and barked until the wind erased his voice. No one came. He ran farther and reached another small house with a pickup buried in the driveway. Again he scratched. Again there was no answer. Ranger turned back into the whiteout. Then he saw a weak golden square glowing through the trees. About 350 yards from the crash stood an old cedar-sided cabin at the end of Bennett Road. Inside, 74-year-old Ruth Bennett sat beside a wood stove with a wool blanket across her knees and an oil lamp burning on the table. Ruth was only 5'3", slender with age, with silver-white hair gathered loosely behind her head and hazel eyes that could still make a dishonest child confess to an overdue library book without her raising her voice. She had spent more than 30 years as the librarian at Silver Creek Elementary. People once remembered her as warm, observant, quietly funny, and generous with anyone who needed help. 12 difficult years had made her more private. She still spoke kindly when spoken to, attended church occasionally, and exchanged supplies with a few old neighbors. But most evenings ended exactly like this one. Ruth, the stove, a book, and an empty house filled with objects that had belonged to her husband. 3 violent scratches struck the front door. Ruth looked up. Another scratch followed. Then a bark so desperate she set the book aside immediately. She opened the door and freezing air rushed inside. Ranger stood on the porch, snow covering his back and muzzle, blood marking one front leg. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Ruth looked for a collar tag, then for a person behind him. There was no one. Ranger stared at her, turned toward the road, ran several steps into the storm, then stopped and looked back. Ruth narrowed her eyes. "You didn't come all this way for a warm fireplace, did you?" Ranger barked once. Ruth did not hesitate again. She pulled on an oversized canvas winter coat that had belonged to her late husband, Henry Bennett, slipped insulated boots over her socks, grabbed a heavy flashlight, and clipped an old emergency radio to her belt. Henry had insisted decades ago that every isolated Montana house needed a radio, even when the telephone worked perfectly. Ruth had teased him about it then. Tonight she silently thanked him. Ranger led her through the storm, repeatedly running ahead and doubling back as if afraid the elderly woman might disappear behind him. Within minutes, the shape of the wrecked Ford emerged between the trees. "Oh, Lord," Ruth whispered. She reached the driver's side and saw Caleb motionless behind the airbag. She found a pulse at his neck, weak enough to frighten her, steady enough to give her hope. "Stay with us, young man." Ruth keyed the radio. "Tom Avery, come in. Tom, answer me." Static filled the speaker before a man's voice broke through. "Ruth?" Tom Avery lived roughly half a mile downhill. At 62, he was a broad-built man with a gray beard, damaged knees, and the practical calm of someone who had spent 25 years as a volunteer EMT before age convinced him that carrying injured strangers down mountains was a younger man's work. He was also one of the few people in Silver Creek who had continued checking on Ruth after Henry's name became something most townspeople preferred not to mention. Ruth gave him the location. 20 minutes later, Tom appeared through the storm, pulling an old rescue sled behind him, one Henry had once kept for volunteer fire calls. Together, they stabilized Caleb as carefully as conditions allowed, freed him from the seatbelt, moved him onto the sled, and hauled him back toward Ruth's cabin. Ranger stayed beside Caleb the entire way. Under the warm light of Ruth's oil lamps, Tom examined Caleb. The shoulder was badly bruised, there was a cut above the temple, and a concussion was likely, but his pupils remained equal and his breathing stayed regular. "He needs a hospital," Ruth said. Tom looked toward the windows, shaking in the wind. "He needs one. Doesn't mean we can get him to one. Highway Patrol says the road is buried in 3 places, and nobody's sending an ambulance up Bennett Road tonight. We keep him warm, wake him regularly, watch his breathing, and call immediately if anything changes." Ruth nodded. It was not much of a plan, but storms often reduced life to the things people could actually do rather than the things they wished they could do. Several hours later, Caleb opened his eyes. Pain arrived first, followed by the strange realization that he was warm. His vision slowly sharpened on wooden ceiling beams he did not recognize. He tried to move, winced, and managed a single word. "Ranger?" The German shepherd rose instantly from beside the stove. Caleb's entire expression changed. Ranger crossed the room and pressed his muzzle against Caleb's hand. "Hey, buddy." Caleb closed his fingers weakly around the dog's fur. Only after assuring himself Ranger was alive did he notice Ruth seated nearby and Tom asleep in an old chair. His gaze traveled around the unfamiliar cabin. On one wall hung a photograph of a silver-haired man wearing the dark jacket of a Silver Creek volunteer firefighter. The man had a broad face, steady eyes, and one hand resting comfortably on Ruth's shoulder in an older photograph beside it. Near the frame was a yellowed newspaper clipping. Caleb focused long enough to read the headline. "Local Inspector Blamed in Bridge Safety Scandal." Ruth followed his gaze. For the first time since Caleb had awakened, something guarded entered her face. She crossed the room, lifted the framed clipping, and quietly turned it face down. Caleb could have asked. He did not. Ruth seemed grateful for that. After midnight, the wind finally weakened enough that the old cabin stopped trembling. Caleb slept on the sofa, while Tom rested nearby, and Ruth dozed in her bedroom. Ranger lay on the rug beside Caleb, his body positioned so one paw almost touched the sofa. Then his ears lifted. He heard something too faint for any sleeping human to notice. Ranger stood and listened. For several seconds he looked back at Caleb. Then, unusually, he walked away. He crossed the kitchen, entered the mudroom, and nudged through a door Ruth had not fully latched earlier. Beyond it stood Henry Bennett's old workshop, a cold room filled with dusty tools, stacked lumber, machine oil, and 12 years of silence. Ranger moved between an old workbench and a wooden cabinet. He stopped over one section of floor. His nose moved close to the boards. He sniffed, tilted his head, then scratched once. A faint hollow sound answered from below. Ranger scratched again, harder this time. The board shifted slightly beneath his claws. Something was underneath Henry Bennett's workshop floor. And for 12 years, Ruth had been living only a few steps away without knowing it was there. Morning came without sunlight. By 7 o'clock on January 28, 2026, the blizzard still owned Silver Creek. Snow pressed against the lower half of Ruth Bennett's kitchen windows, and every fresh gust sent powder curling beneath the porch roof like smoke. The power remained out across the north side of town, while the battery radio repeated the same warning every half hour. County roads closed, mountain passes impassable, travel prohibited except for emergency crews. Caleb Morgan woke on Ruth's sofa with a headache behind his eyes and a shoulder that protested before he even tried to sit up. Ranger was already awake on the rug beside him, watching. The German shepherd had apparently slept facing Caleb all night, his body positioned between the sofa and the front door. Tom Avery had left before dawn after checking Caleb one last time, promising to return if the weather allowed. Ruth, meanwhile, behaved as though sheltering an injured former Marine and a 70-pound working dog was merely another winter inconvenience. She moved around the kitchen in a faded blue cardigan over a flannel nightgown, silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, cracking eggs into an iron skillet while coffee bubbled in an old stovetop percolator. "How long was I out?" Caleb asked. "Long enough for me to discover you snore less than the dog," Ruth said. Caleb glanced at Ranger. "That's disappointing. He usually has better manners." Ranger's ears moved at the sound of his name, but the rest of him remained still. Ruth placed eggs, toast, and coffee in front of Caleb. When he reached carefully for his wallet, she looked at his hand rather than his face. "Put that away. Mrs. Bennett, you pulled me out of a wreck and fed me. At least let me cover in a storm like this. A living person sitting at the table is worth more than money sitting in a drawer." Her voice was gentle, but Caleb recognized the tone of someone who had already ended the argument. He returned the wallet to his pocket. Ruth nodded once, satisfied. The radio reported that crews might need several days to clear Bennett Road. Caleb stared toward the window. Being unable to leave should have frustrated him. Instead, he felt something closer to exhaustion. For once, the weather had made the decision he had been refusing to make for himself. He was going nowhere. By late morning, Caleb became restless enough to start looking for things that needed fixing. Ruth objected when he stood, but he ignored her with the practiced politeness of a man accustomed to working through pain. His left shoulder could move, though lifting anything heavy sent a deep ache through it. He tightened a loose hinge on the pantry door, replaced 2 screws in a section of porch railing that had begun to shift, and braced the shutter beside the kitchen window so it would stop hammering against the siding whenever the wind changed direction. None of the jobs mattered much. That was precisely why Caleb liked them. A hinge required a screwdriver, not an explanation. A loose board could be made solid. Grief was less cooperative. Ranger followed him through every task. When Caleb stepped into the mudroom, Ranger stood. When Caleb went outside for less than a minute to secure the shutter, the dog pressed against the glass and watched until he returned. Later, Caleb went around the corner of the small woodshed to inspect a loose support, and before 10 seconds had passed, Ranger came charging through the snow to find him. "I'm right here," Caleb said. Ranger stopped abruptly, almost embarrassed, then positioned himself beside Caleb's leg, as if that had been the plan all along. Ruth watched from the porch, but offered no comment. She seemed to understand that attention could sometimes make fear worse. She treated Ranger in the same way she treated a wary child from her years at the library. She made room and waited. She never called him over, never reached suddenly for his head. She placed a bowl of warm water beside the stove and left it there. When she added a few pieces of plain cooked beef that evening, she put them down without looking at him. Ranger inspected the bowl, glanced immediately at Caleb, and backed away. Ruth simply continued reading. The following morning he drank from it. By the third day, he crossed the kitchen alone, ate the food Ruth had placed down, and did not look at Caleb for. Caleb noticed. Ruth noticed him noticing. Neither said anything. The third evening brought another surge of wind off the mountains. It arrived after dark with a low roar through the trees, then struck the cabin hard enough to shake a row of old ceramic mugs hanging beneath a shelf. Ranger exploded to his feet. His ears flattened, his muscles locked beneath his coat, and his breathing changed from slow to shallow in seconds. Caleb immediately reached toward him. "Ranger, here!" The dog came, but his eyes remained fixed on the window. Another gust rolled against the house. Ranger flinched. Caleb rested a hand against the dog's neck. "It's wind, buddy. That's all." Ruth sat in her rocking chair near the stove, knitting slowly with gray wool. She watched Ranger for several seconds before speaking. "I don't think he's afraid of the wind." Caleb looked across the room. Ruth's knitting needles continued moving. "Then what is he afraid of?" "Whatever came with it the last time." Caleb stopped rubbing Ranger's neck. The sentence found a place inside him no doctor had managed to reach. For a long while, only the stove crackled between them. Eventually, Caleb said, "There was an avalanche." Ruth did not put down her knitting or lean forward with the eager concern of someone expecting a confession. She simply waited. Caleb appreciated that. "Ranger found a family buried in a slide 7 weeks ago. 4 people, parents and 2 kids. We got them all out." His thumb moved slowly through the fur beneath Ranger's collar. Then the mountain broke again. He told Ruth about Mason Reed, though not everything. He described Mason's crooked smile, his habit of carrying cinnamon gum on every search, the way he could make a team laugh when everyone had been awake for 20 hours. He told her Mason had seen the second slide coming and shoved Caleb clear. He did not describe the sound of Mason disappearing. He did not describe Ranger digging. Not yet. "He saved me," Caleb finished. "Ranger saw it." Ruth's needles stopped for the first time. "And now the dog thinks if he stops watching you, something might take you too." Caleb looked at Ranger. "Maybe." Ruth studied Caleb for a moment. "And you?" He knew exactly what she was asking. "I don't know what I think." Ruth resumed knitting. "Sometimes that's the more honest answer." Caleb's eyes drifted toward the photograph on the wall, the one Ruth had turned away from him the night he arrived. The framed newspaper clipping remained face down on the shelf beneath it. He hesitated before asking, "Was Henry your husband?" Ruth looked toward the photograph. The man in it had broad hands, silver hair, and the sturdy build of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. 43 years, she said. He could fix anything except his own stubbornness. A brief smile appeared, then faded. Caleb waited. Ruth eventually set the knitting aside. Henry Bennett was the county road and bridge safety inspector in 2014. He'd worked public roads most of his adult life and volunteered with Silver Creek Fire on weekends. People trusted him once. The final word carried weight. She explained Pine Hollow Bridge, a steel and timber mountain crossing northwest of town, used heavily by Caldwell Timber. Years of loaded logging trucks had worn the structure badly, and Henry discovered cracking around 2 load-bearing sections. He recommended an immediate weight restriction until engineers could perform a full structural review. Caldwell Timber objected. Their loaded trucks would have been forced onto a longer route, adding more than 30 miles each way, costing the company fuel, time, and money every day. Henry told them a bridge doesn't negotiate, Ruth said. If it can't carry the weight, it can't carry the weight. Several weeks later, a Caldwell truck damaged a section of railing while crossing. Public attention turned to the bridge, and an official inspection report appeared, stating that Pine Hollow remained safe for normal logging traffic. Henry's signature was at the bottom. He said he never signed it, Ruth continued. He said the wording wasn't his either. Then, financial records surfaced, suggesting Henry had received payments linked indirectly to a Caldwell contractor. Ruth never understood exactly how the records had been created, only that they looked convincing enough to people already searching for someone to blame. Henry was suspended. Reporters came to the house. Strangers drove slowly past the property. One morning, someone painted the word liar across their mailbox. Ruth had spent 30 years helping children choose books at the elementary school, yet parents who had known her for decades suddenly stopped making eye contact in the grocery store. Henry refused to accept the accusation. He gathered copies of inspection records, delivery schedules, bridge photographs, and whatever else he believed could prove someone had altered his report. Ruth begged him to hire a lawyer and let someone else carry the fight. Henry tried, but lawyers needed evidence, not certainty. Then, 3 months after the scandal began, Henry drove toward Helena during a heavy rainstorm. His pickup went through a guardrail on a mountain road and fell down an embankment. He died before rescuers reached him. Investigators concluded he had lost control on wet pavement. Ruth stared into the fire as she said it. "I spent nearly half our savings trying to get somebody to look at everything again. They told me grief makes people search for explanations." Caleb did not tell her they might have been right. He knew better than most how insulting a reasonable sentence could sound when spoken to someone whose world had already broken. "Daniel?" he asked, remembering a family photograph on the hallway shelf. Ruth's face changed. Their son Daniel Bennett had been 35 when the scandal began, broad-shouldered like Henry but more impatient, with brown hair, clear hazel eyes, and a temperament shaped by years of loving two stubborn parents who rarely knew when to stop fighting for something. Daniel never fully believed Henry was corrupt. His anger came from somewhere more painful. He believed Henry's obsession with clearing his name was destroying Ruth along with himself. Their final argument happened 2 days before Henry died. Daniel had stood in this very kitchen and said, "Dad, choose Mom for once. Let this go." Then he returned to Oregon. Henry died 2 days later. Daniel came back for the funeral but left Silver Creek shortly afterward. Calls became monthly, then occasional. Neither mother nor son knew how to cross the distance grief had built between them. Caleb stared at the fire for a long time. "Why did you stay?" Ruth looked around the cabin Henry had repaired, expanded, and filled with decades of ordinary life. "Because this was our home." She paused. "And because if I left, the lie would be the last thing Silver Creek remembered about Henry." The wind moved around the cabin again, softer this time. Ranger raised his head but did not stand. Later, after Ruth had gone to bed, Caleb noticed Ranger leave the rug and move toward the workshop for the second night. He followed with a flashlight. Ranger stopped over the same floorboard and scratched. Caleb crouched, despite the pain in his shoulder. He ran his fingers along the edge of the plank and noticed tiny gaps where mice had been moving through a hollow space below. "So that's what you've been hearing." Ranger sniffed along the seam. Caleb fetched a flat pry bar from Henry's old workbench and carefully lifted the worn board. Beneath it was a narrow cavity between the joists, dusty and webbed with age. Something metallic reflected the flashlight. Caleb reached inside and pulled out a small, rusted tin box. Ruth, awakened by the noise, appeared in the doorway wearing her cardigan over her nightgown. "What did you find?" Caleb opened the box. There was no money, no documents, no hidden confession. Only a single old brass key attached to a faded metal tag. Caleb wiped the dust away with his thumb. 2 characters had been stamped into it. F-17. Ruth stepped closer. Her face lost its color. Caleb looked at her. "You recognize it?" For several seconds, Ruth said nothing. Then she took the key into her hand. "F," she whispered. "Firehouse." Caleb waited. Ruth closed her fingers around the key and looked toward the darkness beyond the workshop windows. F-17 was Henry's locker at the old Silver Creek Volunteer Fire Station. By the 6th morning after the blizzard struck Silver Creek, the snow had finally stopped falling. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural. For days, the wind had screamed around Ruth Bennett's cabin, rattled the windows, and buried every familiar shape beneath drifting white. Now the sky above Montana was a hard, pale blue, the temperature still several degrees below freezing, and sunlight flashed painfully across 6-foot snowbanks. The storm had ended, but Bennett Road remained buried. County crews were clearing the main routes first, and the radio warned residents that several smaller roads might remain inaccessible for another 2 or 3 days. Caleb Morgan stood at the kitchen window, with his left arm resting carefully against his side, watching Ranger nose through a path Tom Avery had shoveled between the porch and the woodshed. The German shepherd moved more calmly now. He still checked Caleb often, but not every few seconds. Ruth sat at the table, turning the brass key marked F-17 between her fingers. She had barely spoken since they found it beneath Henry's workshop floor 2 nights earlier. "The old station is less than a mile," she finally said. Caleb looked at her. "That doesn't make it ours to walk into." Ruth raised one eyebrow. "Henry volunteered there for 26 years, still town property." She almost smiled. "You really were a Marine." "Former Marine. Same stubbornness." Caleb accepted the accusation. Instead of arguing, Ruth reached for the emergency radio and contacted Silver Creek's current fire chief. The man who answered was Chief Samuel Keene, 56 years old, tall and raw-boned with thinning gray hair and a deep voice roughened by decades of smoke, cold air, and too much coffee. Keene had joined the volunteer department as a teenager and had known Henry Bennett when Henry was already one of the older men everyone trusted around machinery. Unlike many people in Silver Creek, Keene had never publicly accused Henry after the scandal, though he had also never defended him loudly enough for Ruth to forget the silence. He listened while Ruth explained that she had found a key marked F-17 and believed it belonged to Henry's old locker. There was a long pause over the radio. "Those lockers are still there," Keene finally said. "The building's mostly storage now. We moved the active department downtown 8 years ago." Ruth tightened her fingers around the radio. "Can we look?" Another pause. "If Tom goes with you, and you don't disturb anything that isn't Henry's, yes. West side door sticks. Lift before you pull." Ruth thanked him. Keene hesitated before signing off. "Ruth?" "Yes?" "If Henry left something there, I hope it gives you some peace." Ruth stared at the radio after the channel went silent. Caleb did not ask what she thought of that. An hour later, Tom arrived wearing snowshoes and carrying a thermos, his gray beard crusted with frost. He took one look at Caleb's shoulder and said, "You planning to behave today?" Caleb replied, "Probably not." Tom grunted, "Good. I'd hate for the concussion to change your personality." The walk to the old Silver Creek Volunteer Fire Station took nearly 40 minutes, despite being less than a mile. Snowshoes kept them from sinking to their knees, but drifts had piled waist-high in places where the wind had swept across open ground. Ruth moved slower than the 2 men, but never complained. Ranger ranged several yards ahead, then returned periodically, his black and tan coat stark against the snow. Caleb noticed something he had not seen since before Mason died: curiosity. Ranger stopped to investigate rabbit tracks, sniffed a buried fence post, and once plunged his muzzle into loose powder before sneezing violently. Tom laughed. "Still got some dog left in him." Caleb looked down at Ranger. "More every day." The old fire station appeared behind a stand of cottonwoods, a low brick building with faded red doors and a weather-beaten sign that still read, "Silver Creek Volunteer Fire Company, No. 1. Snow covered the parking lot, and one corner of the roof carried a heavy white overhang. Ruth stopped for a moment. She had not been inside since Henry's memorial service 12 years earlier. Caleb noticed the hesitation, but did not touch her or tell her she had to continue. Ruth took a breath and walked forward on her own. The west door opened exactly as Chief Keene had described. Tom lifted it slightly while Caleb pulled. Inside, the air smelled of cold concrete, old rubber hose, dust, and the faint metallic scent of tools that had not moved in years. The main apparatus bay had become storage for folding tables, traffic barriers, old Christmas decorations, and retired emergency equipment. Along the rear wall stood 2 rows of dented steel lockers. F-17 was in the second row. The faded white stencil was barely visible beneath scratches and rust. Ruth stopped in front of it. "He kept extra gloves in there," she said softly. "Jerky, usually. Henry believed every emergency could be improved by beef jerky." Tom smiled. He wasn't wrong. Caleb stepped aside. "You should open it." Ruth inserted the brass key. For a moment it resisted, then the mechanism clicked. The sound was small, but all 3 humans went still. Ruth pulled the locker door open. Inside, nothing looked dramatic at first. An old yellow fire helmet rested on the upper shelf. Beneath it sat a canvas bag, several folded papers, a small black notebook secured with a rubber band, a padded envelope, an outdated digital voice recorder, and a plastic case holding an SD card. Ruth reached for the helmet before anything else. Henry B. was written in black marker along the inner rim. Her thumb passed slowly across the letters. Then Caleb examined the documents. Several were carbon copies of county inspection forms. Henry had dated and initialed each one. One report concerned Pine Hollow Bridge. Caleb read the handwritten conclusion twice. Pine Hollow Bridge unsafe for loaded logging trucks, pending structural review. Ruth leaned closer. That's what Henry always said he wrote. Caleb placed another page beside it, a photocopy Ruth had saved from the official investigation. That version stated that the bridge could remain open to normal commercial traffic with routine monitoring. Both carried Henry Bennett's name. But the signatures were not identical. The official version's first B rose more sharply. The final T in Bennett curved differently. Caleb did not claim forgery. He knew enough about evidence not to outrun what the documents actually proved. "They're different," he said. "That's all I'd say without someone qualified looking at them." Ruth did not seem disappointed. For 12 years, different was more than she had possessed. Tom opened the canvas bag while Ruth examined a thick envelope of shipping receipts. The invoices showed repeated Caldwell timber loads crossing the Pine Hollow route in the weeks before the bridge incident. Several listed gross vehicle weights well above the temporary figures Henry had written in his notebook. Caleb found the name Frank Dorsey circled on 3 pages. Beside one entry, Henry had written, "Ask Frank about night loads." Ruth remembered Frank immediately. He had been Caldwell Timber's shift superintendent, a thick-bodied man in his late 50s back then, with close-cropped reddish hair turning gray, and a booming voice that could be heard across a lumberyard without amplification. Frank had never been cruel to Ruth, but after Henry's suspension he stopped coming into the diner when Henry was there. Within months of Henry's death, Frank sold his house and left Silver Creek. "No goodbye?" Caleb asked. Ruth shook her head. "Not to us." The small notebook contained dates, license plate numbers, bridge measurements, names of county employees, and terse reminders written in Henry's blocky handwriting. Caleb turned pages slowly, careful not to damage the paper. Ruth found a sealed letter tucked into the back cover. Her name was written across the front. She opened it at the old folding table. The paper inside had yellowed at the edges. Henry's writing was steady. Ruth read silently at first, then stopped. Caleb watched her face change. She handed him the letter because her hands had begun to tremble. Henry had written that if Ruth ever found the documents, she should not confront Caldwell Timber herself. He believed people inside the company had altered records and were watching what he was doing. He apologized for keeping information from her, explaining that secrecy was the only way he knew to protect her if his investigation failed. Near the bottom was a line underlined twice. "Frank knows why the report changed." Ruth pressed her lips together. He knew. Caleb looked up. "Frank?" Henry knew Frank knew something. The room seemed colder than before. The voice recorder would not power on. The battery compartment showed corrosion, and Caleb refused to force it. "We'll need someone who can recover whatever's on this without damaging it." Ruth nodded reluctantly. The SD card was easier. Caleb had brought his laptop in a waterproof pack, partly because he had expected old records, and partly because sitting idle for 6 days had taught him to prepare for anything. He inserted the card. Dozens of image files appeared. Most showed Pine Hollow Bridge from different angles. Cracked timber, rust staining beneath bolts, loaded logging trucks crossing, close-ups of license plates, and photographs of road signs. Henry had documented patiently, almost obsessively. Then Caleb noticed a folder labeled Home Camera. Inside were images from a trail camera positioned somewhere near the Bennett workshop. Snowy deer, a raccoon, Ruth carrying groceries, Henry stacking firewood. Caleb moved through them until the date in the corner reached 3 days before Henry died. A white Caldwell timber service truck appeared in the driveway. The next image showed a man climbing out. The camera angle was distant but clear enough to identify his face. He wore a dark work jacket, heavy boots, and a Caldwell cap. He was medium height, thick through the waist, with thinning dark hair and a heavy mustache. Ruth leaned toward the screen. Her breathing changed. "Roy Vickers." Caleb looked at her. Ruth explained that Roy had worked maintenance for Caldwell Timber. He had been around 60 now, younger and heavier in the photograph, known in town as a capable mechanic with an impatient temper and a habit of talking to machines more kindly than he talked to people. Henry had known him for years. The next image showed Roy beside Henry's pickup. The image after that showed him crouched near the front driver's side wheel, one hand disappearing beneath the truck. Tom swore under his breath. Ruth stared at the screen as if the room had fallen away around her. Caleb immediately closed the laptop halfway. "Ruth." She looked at him. "He was under Henry's truck." "Yes." 2 days before Henry died." "Yes." Her voice sharpened. "Then what more do you need?" Caleb stayed calm. "A photograph shows Roy beside the truck. It doesn't show why he was there. He could have been checking a tire, looking at a brake line, retrieving something Henry dropped. We don't know." Ruth stood abruptly. "Henry's brakes, we don't know that either." Caleb's words were firm, not dismissive. "If this matters, we have to be more careful than the people who blamed Henry were. We don't decide what happened first and then force the evidence to fit." Ruth stared at him. The anger in her face lasted several seconds before it broke into something more painful. "I've waited 12 years for someone to believe him." Caleb softened. "I believe you believe him. And I believe this deserves to be looked at. That's different from pretending we already know the ending." Ranger, lying near the lockers, lifted his head as Ruth slowly sat again. Tom poured coffee from his thermos into the lid and handed it to her without comment. Caleb reopened Henry's notebook. The photographs had changed the room. Every earlier document suggested manipulation, pressure, perhaps fraud. The image of Roy beside the truck suggested something else, but only suggested. Caleb went back through Henry's notes, searching each mention of Roy Vickers. Most were mundane: vehicle numbers, maintenance dates, names of drivers. Then, near the final pages, he found Roy's name written alone at the top of a sheet. Beneath it, Henry had drawn a short line toward another name: Frank Dorsey. There was only one sentence beside them. Caleb read it once, then again. Ruth noticed his expression. "What?" Caleb turned the notebook toward her. Henry's handwriting filled only a single line. "Ask Frank what they told him to do." No one spoke. Outside the old fire station, snow slid from the roof with a heavy thump. Ranger stood immediately, ears forward. But this time Caleb barely noticed. Because for the first time since they opened locker F-17, the question was no longer only whether Henry Bennett had been framed. It was whether someone else had known exactly how it was done. On the 10th morning after the blizzard, the first county plow finally reached Bennett Road. The storm had passed 4 days earlier, but Silver Creek still looked half-buried beneath it. Snowbanks rose above car hoods, broken pine limbs leaned over ditches, and dirty ridges of packed snow lined the reopened highway toward Bozeman. At 8:15 that morning, the temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit beneath a pale Montana sky. Caleb Morgan stood beside his Ford F-250, while Tom Avery helped check the repaired passenger window with a temporary plastic seal. Caleb's shoulder had improved, but the deep ache returned whenever he lifted his arm too high, and the bruise across his chest had turned from purple to yellow. He had already received 2 messages from Gallatin Mountain Search and Rescue. One instructed him to report for a medical follow-up in Bozeman. The second confirmed that Ranger's behavioral recovery program would begin the following morning. Caleb knew what that meant. Whatever Henry Bennett had hidden in locker F-17, Caleb could not stay in Silver Creek and turn himself into an investigator. He was a search and rescue handler, not a detective, and he had his own responsibilities waiting for him. Before leaving, however, he spent nearly 3 hours at Ruth's kitchen table organizing everything they had found. He photographed each page of Henry's notebook, copied the SD card onto 2 separate drives, scanned the carbon inspection reports, and built a simple timeline beginning with Henry's Pine Hollow Bridge inspection in 2014 and ending with his fatal crash 3 months later. Ruth sat opposite him, reading dates aloud while Caleb entered them into the laptop. They added the overloaded Caldwell timber shipments, the altered inspection report, Frank Dorsey's name, Roy Vickers appearing beside Henry's pickup 2 days before the crash, and the still unread digital recorder. Caleb made Ruth keep the originals in a fireproof metal box. "Copies travel," he told her. "Originals stay together." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You always this bossy when people rescue you from snowbanks?" "Only when I'm grateful." Leaving turned out to be harder than either expected. Ruth packed sandwiches for Caleb despite his insistence that Bozeman contained grocery stores. Tom stood near the porch pretending to inspect the truck rather than participate in anything emotional. Ranger lingered beside Ruth. During the 10 days in the cabin, he had begun drinking from the bowl she filled, sleeping several feet away from Caleb, and occasionally following Ruth into the kitchen without first checking where Caleb was. Now, when Caleb opened the passenger door and called him, Ranger did not immediately jump inside. Instead, he walked to Ruth and pressed his broad head beneath her hand. Ruth's fingers disappeared into the thick fur behind his ears. "This boy isn't completely all right yet," she said quietly. Caleb looked at Ranger, then at her. "Neither am I." Ruth's hazel eyes softened. "Then don't rush, either one of you." Ranger finally climbed into the truck. As Caleb drove away, he glanced in the mirror and saw Ruth standing on the porch in Henry's oversized winter coat, until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. The next 3 weeks divided Caleb's life between recovery and questions he could not quite leave alone. In Bozeman, his shoulder was cleared of any serious structural injury, though the physician ordered another 2 weeks without heavy work. Ranger began sessions with Dr. Melissa Grant, a 48-year-old canine behavior specialist contracted by the SAR team. Melissa was a tall, athletic woman with short auburn hair, rectangular glasses, and the patient manner of someone who had spent 20 years learning that frightened animals rarely improved because humans became louder. She had worked with police, military, and wilderness dogs after injuries and traumatic events, and she refused to use the word broken for any of them. Her first instruction to Caleb was simple. Stop testing Ranger every minute to see whether he had recovered. "You keep watching him for fear," she said, "and he keeps watching you for fear. Somebody has to blink first." Caleb did not enjoy hearing that, which was partly how he knew she was right. Meanwhile, Ruth used the Silver Creek Library computer, county directories, old property records, and several phone calls to track Frank Dorsey. She found him 35 miles east of Silver Creek, outside a small community called Laurel Bend. Exactly 3 weeks after leaving Ruth's cabin, Caleb drove back to Silver Creek on his first full day off. Ranger rode beside him, noticeably calmer than before. He still watched Caleb, but he spent part of the drive with his nose toward the window instead of studying every movement of Caleb's hands. Ruth was waiting with an address written on an index card. Frank Dorsey, she said. Still alive. 71. Lives alone now. Caleb looked at her. You called him? No. Good. I thought appearing on his porch might be more polite. Caleb stared at her. Ruth smiled faintly. You've been away 3 weeks. I had time to become difficult again. Frank Dorsey lived in a faded, single-wide trailer on 5 acres of wind-blown pasture outside Laurel Bend. An old Ford Ranger sat beneath a lean-to, and split firewood was stacked with obsessive neatness beside the steps. Frank answered Caleb's knock wearing worn jeans and a red thermal shirt. At 71, he was still thick through the chest, though age had softened his once powerful frame. His reddish hair had faded almost completely to gray, and a heavy mustache covered his upper lip. His hands were swollen at the knuckles from decades of mill and equipment work. Ruth had remembered his voice as booming, but the man standing in the doorway sounded tired. I don't talk about Caldwell, he said before Caleb had finished introducing himself. We're not reporters, Caleb replied. Don't care. Frank started closing the door. Then Ruth stepped out from behind Caleb. Frank froze. For several seconds, his face seemed to lose every expression at once. Ruth. Hello, Frank. His hand stayed on the door. You shouldn't have come. I waited 12 years, Ruth said. That seems long enough. Frank looked past her toward Ranger sitting beside Caleb's leg, then toward the empty road as though checking whether anyone else had followed. Finally, he opened the door. 5 minutes. They stayed nearly 2 hours. Frank's trailer was clean but sparse, decorated with photographs of 2 adult daughters and several grandchildren. He made coffee nobody wanted and sat at the small kitchen table with both hands wrapped around his mug. For the first 10 minutes, he claimed he remembered very little. Caleb did not push. Ruth did. Henry wrote your name, Frank's eyes lifted. Where? Somewhere you never knew about. Silence filled the trailer. Ruth placed a photocopy of the original Pine Hollow inspection report on the table. Frank looked at Henry's handwriting and closed his eyes. Something inside him gave way. Caldwell knew, he said. The confession came quietly. In 2014, Frank had been the night shift superintendent for Caldwell Timber, responsible for dispatching trucks, scheduling drivers, and keeping loads moving between the logging sites and the mill. Henry had warned the company that Pine Hollow Bridge could not safely carry fully loaded logging trucks until a structural review was completed. Several managers ignored the restriction. After a loaded truck struck and damaged the bridge railing, panic spread through Caldwell's offices because county investigators would inevitably ask why traffic had continued. According to Frank, a senior operations manager ordered him to state that Henry Bennett had personally told Caldwell the bridge remained safe for full loads. Frank initially refused. I knew Henry, he said. He would have shut the whole road before he signed something like that. Then the pressure started. Frank's wife, Linda Dorsey, had been 46 at the time, a petite, dark-haired woman battling an aggressive autoimmune disease that required expensive medication and regular hospital treatment. Caldwell Timber provided Frank's family health insurance. The small house where Frank and Linda raised their 2 daughters also sat on company-owned land under an employee housing arrangement. Frank said management reminded him of both facts. Lose the job, lose the insurance. Lose the job, leave the house. His daughters were 16 and 13. They didn't have to threaten me with a gun, Frank whispered. They just told me exactly what my family would lose. He signed a statement claiming Henry had approved continued traffic across the bridge. That statement became part of the case against Henry. Ruth sat perfectly still while Frank spoke. Her hands were clenched beneath the table. You knew it wasn't true. Frank nodded. Yes. And you watched them destroy him. Yes. Anger finally reached Ruth's voice. You watched people spit at him in town. You watched him lose his job. You watched me walk into that grocery store while people whispered behind me. Frank did not defend himself. Yes. Ruth stood and walked toward the window. Caleb thought she might leave. Instead, she turned around. Her eyes were wet, but steady. "Did Henry know they forced you?" Frank looked down at his hands. "Yes." Ruth swallowed. "Did he hate you?" That question broke him. Frank covered his face. His shoulders shook once before the tears came. No, that was worse. He told them Henry had visited him privately after discovering the false statement. Frank confessed everything. Henry had listened and then told him to protect his wife and daughters. He never threatened Frank or demanded that he publicly recant. "He said he'd find another way," Frank whispered. Before they left, Frank remembered one additional detail. Several weeks before Henry died, the two men encountered each other behind a hardware store. Henry had seemed exhausted but strangely hopeful. He told Frank, "I finally got Caldwell talking when he thought nobody important was listening." Frank assumed Henry meant he had recorded something. Caleb immediately thought of the digital recorder from F-17. Back in Bozeman 2 days later, Caleb took the damaged recorder to Aaron Pike, a 34-year-old electronics technician who ran a narrow repair shop crowded with vintage radios, cameras, audio decks, and disassembled laptops. Aaron was thin, pale, perpetually unshaven, with curly black hair and the distracted manner of a man who often remembered circuits better than people's names. He warned Caleb that the corroded battery and obsolete connector made recovery uncertain. Instead of attempting to power the device normally, Aaron removed the storage module and copied its contents using an adapter he had built for older equipment. Several hours later, one audio file appeared. Caleb called Ruth before listening to it. They played the recording at her kitchen table that evening. Henry Bennett's voice emerged through static first, lower and stronger than Caleb had expected. The second voice belonged to Dean Caldwell. Ruth identified it immediately. Dean had been in his early 50s in 2014, a tall, polished businessman with carefully combed silvering hair, expensive Western boots, and the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms where others already knew his name. On the recording, Dean urged Henry to sign the revised bridge report and stop making a county problem into a war. Henry refused. Dean's voice hardened. "You keep pushing this, Henry, and you're going to lose more than your job." Several seconds of static followed. Then Henry answered, calm and unmistakable. "Then I'll lose it telling the truth." The recording ended less than a minute later. Ruth stared at the recorder. "He threatened him." Caleb nodded carefully. "He pressured him, maybe threatened him. But this doesn't prove Caldwell ordered anyone to hurt Henry." Ruth looked frustrated, but Caleb continued. "That's exactly why we stop here. We have documents, a witness who admits his statement was false, photographs of Roy near the truck, and now this recording. This is where professionals take over." Ruth slowly nodded. They agreed to contact the Montana Department of Justice and the appropriate state investigators first thing the following morning, preserving every original file and document. That night, Caleb stayed in Ruth's spare room rather than drive back through the mountains after dark. Shortly after 11, the cabin was quiet. Ruth had gone to bed. Caleb was reading on the sofa. Ranger slept near the stove, his paws twitching lightly in a dream. Then his eyes opened. His head rose. He stared toward the rear of the house. A low growl came from deep in his chest. Caleb immediately set the book down. "Ranger?" The German shepherd stood and moved toward the mudroom, body rigid, nose lifted. A faint metallic sound came from outside. Then wood cracked. Caleb crossed to the kitchen window and switched on the exterior floodlight. For half a second, a dark figure was visible beside Henry Bennett's workshop. The workshop door hung partly broken from its frame. The figure turned toward the sudden light, then ran into the darkness. Caleb did not open the back door. Ranger stood rigid beside him, a low growl vibrating through his chest as the dark figure disappeared beyond Henry Bennett's workshop and into the trees. Every instinct Caleb had developed in the Marines told him to move, close distance, control the unknown. Every lesson he had learned since leaving the service told him something different. He did not know whether the intruder was armed. He did not know whether there was more than one person outside. Most important, he would not send Ranger into darkness after someone whose intentions they did not understand. "Stay," Caleb said quietly. Ranger's muscles remained tight, but he obeyed. Ruth appeared in the hallway wearing her cardigan over her nightclothes, her face pale but composed. "What happened?" "Someone was in the workshop." Caleb already had his phone in his hand. "Don't go outside." The Silver Creek Sheriff's Office answered within seconds. Caleb reported the broken door, the fleeing figure, and the evidence they had recently recovered from Henry's belongings. Within 25 minutes, headlights appeared through the trees. Deputy Laura Mendoza, 44, arrived with another officer. Laura was a compact woman with dark hair braided tightly behind her head, brown eyes that rarely seemed to miss anything, and the calm, economical manner of someone who had spent 17 years handling domestic disputes, crashes, winter rescues, and the occasional serious crime in rural Montana. She had known Ruth by reputation, but had only been a young patrol deputy when Henry died. "Nobody touches the workshop until morning," she said after checking the exterior with Caleb. Fresh snow had preserved several partial footprints, though drifting powder was already softening the edges. The broken latch suggested forced entry. Laura photographed everything and placed temporary evidence markers near the clearest tracks. "Who knew you had found Henry's documents?" she asked. Caleb listed Chief Keene, Tom, Frank Dorsey, Aaron Pike, and a few people connected with the old records. Ruth looked uncomfortable when she realized how quickly a secret could stop being one. Laura did not accuse anyone. Small towns leak information without meaning to. Somebody tells a spouse, somebody mentions something over coffee. That doesn't make them involved. She looked toward the damaged door. But whoever came here was looking for something. At first light, Laura returned with an evidence technician from the county. The workshop looked worse in daylight. 2 drawers in Henry's old workbench had been pulled out and dumped. A metal cabinet stood open. Several old envelopes had been torn apart, and a stack of receipts Caleb had left in a secondary folder was scattered across the floor. Yet an antique socket set, a small air compressor, and several valuable old woodworking tools remained untouched. Ruth stood in the doorway with her arms folded tightly. "They didn't come to steal." Laura nodded. "That would be my impression too." The originals from F-17 were safe inside the fireproof box Ruth had moved into the house. Caleb felt relieved, then angry with himself for feeling relieved. If the person had entered because of the documents, the investigation was no longer a private attempt to understand the past. Someone in the present cared enough to break into Ruth Bennett's property 12 years after Henry's death. By noon, Caleb and Ruth were sitting in a conference room at the county offices with Laura and 2 state investigators joining by video from Helena. Caleb insisted that everything be transferred formally. The packet included Henry's original carbon inspection report, the notebook, the SD card, the restored audio recording, copies of Frank Dorsey's preliminary statement, Henry's crash report, and the timeline Caleb had built at Ruth's kitchen table. He explained exactly where each item had been found and who had handled it. Ruth signed the chain of custody forms with a hand that trembled only once. The senior state investigator, Evan Shaw, was 52, broad-faced and balding with rimless glasses and the measured tone of a man who distrusted dramatic conclusions. He had worked public corruption and cold case reviews for nearly 20 years. "Mrs. Bennett," he told Ruth, "this is not the same thing as reopening a homicide investigation. Not yet. What we can do is conduct a preliminary review of the records and determine whether the original findings deserve formal reconsideration." Ruth nodded. 12 years earlier, people had told her there was nothing to review. Even a cautious maybe sounded different now. Caleb returned to Bozeman the following day because his own unfinished work had not disappeared. Ranger's first formal recovery assessment took place 3 mornings later at a SAR training field outside the city. Dr. Melissa Grant met them beside a snow-covered obstacle course with 3 other evaluators observing from a distance. The first exercises were simple. Ranger followed hand signals, located a hidden glove beneath brush, ignored food distractions, and tracked a volunteer across a short wooded section. For 20 minutes, he looked almost like his old self. His tail lifted when he found the volunteer, and for one brief second, Caleb saw the dog who had once believed every search was a game worth winning. Then they moved to the environmental stress portion. 2 speakers had been positioned behind a snow berm. Melissa warned Caleb before the recording began. "You know what's coming. He doesn't." A low mountain wind filled the field. Ranger's ears moved. Caleb felt his own stomach tighten. The volume increased. Wind became a deeper roar, layered with the cracking sound of loaded snow shifting through trees. Ranger stopped. His tail dropped. His body lowered slightly, and his breathing became fast. Caleb's mind answered with its own memory. Mason shouting, white movement above them, Ranger digging until blood marked the snow. "Ranger, search," Caleb said. The dog did not move. One evaluator checked a stopwatch. Caleb nearly repeated the command. Then he remembered Melissa's warning from their first session. Stop asking the dog to prove every minute that he is no longer afraid. Caleb looked at Ranger instead of the course. The sound from the speakers continued. "Okay," he whispered. He lowered himself onto one knee despite the cold biting through his pants. Ranger glanced at him. Caleb did not grab his collar. He did not pull the leash. "I hear it too." Ranger's breathing slowed by a fraction. Several seconds passed, then another. Ranger took one step forward. He stopped. Then he took another. By the time he resumed the search pattern, the allotted time had already slipped away. He eventually found the hidden volunteer, but well past the performance standard. Caleb expected failure. Melissa approached with her clipboard tucked beneath one arm. "He missed time." "I know." "And he stopped under stress." "I know." Melissa looked at Ranger, who was now sniffing snow near Caleb's boot. "He also restarted without force." Caleb said nothing. "That matters. He still wants the work. What he doesn't have yet is confidence that the environment won't turn against him." She looked directly at Caleb. "Sound familiar?" Caleb almost laughed, but there was no humor in the question. Ranger was not being removed permanently. Instead, Melissa recommended gradual exposure, controlled searches, and another evaluation later. "One step at a time," she said. Caleb looked down at the dog. "Yeah, I'm starting to hear that a lot." While Caleb and Ranger worked through recovery, the state investigators began working backward through 2014. 2 weeks passed before Ruth received the first meaningful update. A forensic document examiner had compared Henry's known signatures with the signature on the official Pine Hollow Bridge approval. The examiner did not declare the document conclusively forged from copies alone, but identified multiple inconsistencies significant enough to justify examination of the original county file. That alone strengthened the review. Then an investigator found a receipt from Henderson Auto and Brake, a repair shop that had closed years earlier. Henry had paid for brake inspection, fluid replacement, and frontline service on his pickup less than 3 weeks before his fatal crash. Ruth remembered the repair. Henry had complained for 2 days that the bill was too high, then admitted the truck stopped better than it had in years. The next discovery came from the tow yard archive. After Henry's crash, the wrecked pickup had been photographed from multiple angles for insurance and storage documentation. Most of those images had never been relevant to the original investigation. In one high-resolution photograph, a state vehicle examiner noticed irregular damage along a brake fluid line near the front driver's side assembly. The 2014 report had treated the damage as crash-related. Now, viewed beside the recent repair invoice and the trail camera images of Roy Vickers near the same part of the truck, the assumption no longer looked as comfortable. No one told Ruth that the line had definitely been sabotaged. The vehicle itself had long since been destroyed, making certainty difficult. But the investigators began asking whether the damage could have occurred before the crash rather than during it. Ruth called Caleb the evening Evan Shaw told her they intended to interview Roy Vickers. Her voice carried something Caleb had not heard before. Fear mixed with anticipation. They're going to ask him why he was at the house. Caleb was sitting on the floor of his apartment, while Ranger chewed slowly on a rubber training toy nearby. That's good. What if he lies? Then they compare the lie with everything else. Ruth was silent. And if he tells the truth? Caleb looked at Ranger. Then we deal with the truth. Roy Vickers still operated a small garage on the western edge of Silver Creek, a corrugated metal building surrounded by rusted trucks, tires, and snow-covered engine parts. He was 59 now, medium height and thick around the waist, with thinning brown-gray hair, the same heavy mustache visible in Henry's trail camera image, and oil permanently darkening the creases of his hands. People in town described Roy as an excellent mechanic who disliked conversation, paperwork, and anyone looking over his shoulder while he worked. Investigators arrived at his garage the following morning. Roy was not there. His truck was gone. His phone went directly to voicemail. A neighbor said the garage had been closed since the previous evening. By afternoon, investigators obtained authority to search the business as part of the expanding inquiry into the break-in and historical records connected with Henry's death. The front work area contained nothing unusual. The rear office was another matter. Behind a filing cabinet sat a cardboard records box coated in years of dust. The faded blue logo on its side belonged to Caldwell Timber. Inside were old maintenance sheets, handwritten job notes, fuel receipts, and employee paperwork dating back more than a decade. Laura Mendoza was present when the box was opened. She lifted the first folder carefully. A name had been written across the tab in black marker, Henry Bennett, and Roy Vickers was nowhere to be found. 4 days after investigators opened the Caldwell Timber records box in Roy Vickers's garage, Roy was found nearly 200 miles away at his younger brother's home outside Sheridan, Wyoming. He had not crossed the state line under a false name, destroyed his truck, or attempted anything dramatic enough to make the evening news. He had simply driven away, shut off his phone, and sat in his brother's spare room while investigators tried to reach him. That distinction mattered. Roy was not officially a fugitive, and no one had charged him with Henry Bennett's death. Not yet. What the Montana investigators had were questions, old records, a trail camera photograph, and a garage full of documents that had survived 12 years longer than anyone expected. Roy eventually contacted an attorney and agreed to return voluntarily for an interview. His lawyer, Martin Sloan, was 54, a narrow-faced man with silver at his temples, carefully pressed suits, and the dry patience of someone who had spent 3 decades preventing frightened clients from making their situations worse by talking too much. Sloan made one thing clear before Roy answered a single question. His client's presence did not mean an admission of wrongdoing. Investigator Evan Shaw agreed. He did not need a confession obtained through pressure. He needed a version of events that could survive contact with the evidence. The Caldwell box from Roy's garage had already provided plenty to compare against whatever Roy chose to say. Inside were yellowing vehicle maintenance schedules, handwritten work orders, old dispatch lists, carbon copy receipts, and several envelopes containing cash payment vouchers issued through Caldwell Timber accounts. Most of the paperwork was ordinary enough to be boring. Oil changes, tire rotations, hydraulic repairs, fuel reimbursements. One entry was not. It had been written on a maintenance sheet dated 2 days before Henry Bennett died. The customer line read simply, Bennett. Under service requested were 2 words, pressure adjustment. No part number, no mileage, no invoice total, no explanation. The handwriting appeared to match Roy's other notes from that period, though investigators sent it for examination rather than assuming. Evans stared at the phrase for a long time. In a brake shop, pressure could mean several legitimate things: hydraulic pressure, tire pressure, line pressure. It could also mean nothing more than shorthand Roy once understood and had forgotten. The phrase did not prove sabotage. But when placed beside Henry's trail camera image showing Roy crouched at the front driver's side of the pickup on the same date, it became difficult to ignore. Frank Dorsey returned to Montana 2 weeks later, and gave a formal, recorded statement. This time there was no kitchen table, no Ruth Bennett across from him, and no chance to soften what he had done by calling it fear. Frank described, under oath, how Caldwell Timber Management pressured him in 2014 to support the claim that Henry had approved continued full-load traffic across Pine Hollow Bridge. He described the threats to his employment, his wife Linda's medical insurance, and the company-owned house where his daughters had grown up. He admitted his statement about Henry had been false. He also admitted that Henry knew the truth and had chosen not to expose Frank publicly. Evan asked why Frank had waited 12 years. Frank took nearly half a minute before answering. "Because every year I waited made the first year harder to admit." That sentence eventually mattered almost as much to Ruth as the legal statement itself. Shame, she realized, had not frozen Frank in 2014 and released him later. It had grown roots. A second witness appeared through old corporate correspondence. Her name was Elaine Porter, 67, a retired administrative secretary who had worked in Caldwell Timber's executive office for 23 years. Elaine was tall and thin, with straight white hair cut to her shoulders, pale green eyes, and a precise way of speaking that made even ordinary sentences sound carefully filed. She had moved to Missoula after retirement and kept boxes of old correspondence because, as she told investigators, "I spent half my life working for men who believed deleting an email meant history disappeared." Elaine had never known the full story behind Henry Bennett, but she remembered the panic surrounding Pine Hollow Bridge. In a storage box, she found printed emails from 2014 that she had kept with personnel documents. Several messages discussed preventing Henry from forwarding bridge inspection material to state transportation officials until Caldwell could resolve the county situation internally. None ordered anyone to hurt Henry. None mentioned breaks. But the messages supported something Henry had insisted on before his death. Company leadership had been actively trying to stop his information from leaving Silver Creek. Weeks turned into months. By late April, the snow around Ruth Bennett's cabin had retreated into dirty islands beneath the pines, and Silver Creek entered that awkward Montana season when mornings still froze, but afternoons smelled faintly of mud and thawing earth. The investigation had now reached its third month. Ruth had spent the first several weeks expecting each phone call to either clear Henry completely or destroy the hope she had only recently allowed herself to feel. Neither happened. Evidence arrived slowly. Documents were examined, witnesses were interviewed twice. Old bank records required legal requests. People remembered things differently after 12 years. Some memories strengthened under documentation, others fell apart. Caleb reminded Ruth whenever impatience began to consume her that slow did not mean nothing was happening. "Search work is the same," he told her. "Sometimes you spend 6 hours finding one footprint. Doesn't make the footprint unimportant." Something else had begun changing in Ruth while the investigation moved at its maddening pace. One Tuesday morning she drove into Silver Creek and entered Miller's Market, the same grocery store where she had once learned to keep her eyes on her shopping list because looking up meant seeing someone glance away. The owner greeted her normally. A one from church asked about her garden. Nobody mentioned Henry. Ruth realized she had spent years preparing herself for humiliation that sometimes was no longer waiting for her. The following Sunday, she returned to Silver Creek Community Church for the first time in months. She sat near the rear, where leaving early would be easy, and remained through the closing hymn. 2 weeks later, the community librarian asked if Ruth would consider helping on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Ruth almost refused automatically. She had spent more than 30 years shelving books, helping children research school projects, and recommending mysteries to retired men who pretended they only read history. That part of her life belonged to the woman she had been before Henry's scandal. Then she wondered why Caldwell, the newspapers, or anyone else should be allowed to own that woman forever. She accepted. Henry had not been formally cleared. The investigation had not concluded that his death was a crime. Ruth knew both facts. Yet for the first time in 12 years, she no longer felt that proving Henry innocent depended entirely upon how fiercely she could hold on to his memory. Other people were carrying pieces of the weight now. Investigators, Frank, Elaine, Caleb, even Tom, who had begun driving her to the library whenever spring mud made Bennett Road difficult. Ruth was still waiting for the truth. She simply was not waiting alone. Caleb and Ranger were changing too. Dr. Melissa Grant continued Ranger's controlled recovery program outside Bozeman. They began in quiet, wooded areas before introducing stronger wind, unfamiliar terrain, distant machinery, and eventually short, simulated searches. Ranger still startled when snow shifted suddenly from high branches. He still checked Caleb more often than he had before Mason died. But now he could recover without immediately abandoning the task. One afternoon, Melissa hid a volunteer nearly half a mile into a mixed pine forest. Ranger worked the scent trail for 23 minutes, briefly lost it near a creek bed, circled back without Caleb correcting him, and found the volunteer crouched behind fallen timber. When the man praised him, Ranger barked once and spun around with such obvious pride that Caleb laughed aloud. 2 days later, Caleb bought him a new tennis ball. At first, Ranger only stared at it. Then Caleb rolled it across the floor. Ranger chased it. The moment lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed afterward, holding the slobbered ball and blinking harder than necessary. By early May, Ranger occasionally slept in the living room while Caleb worked in another room. That would have been unremarkable before Mason. Now it felt enormous. When Caleb drove to Silver Creek one Saturday, Ruth opened the front door before he knocked. Ranger passed Caleb, walked straight into the house, circled once beside Ruth's chair, and lay across her slippers. Caleb stared at him. "Well, that's clear." Ruth bent to scratch Ranger's neck. "What is?" "Apparently I've been replaced." Ruth glanced down at the German shepherd. "At least he doesn't talk much." Caleb put a hand against his chest. "After everything we've been through." Ranger yawned without moving. Ruth laughed, and for several seconds the room contained nothing more complicated than an old woman, a recovering search dog, and a man pretending to be offended by canine disloyalty. Then Ruth's phone rang. The laughter vanished when she saw Evan Shaw's name. She answered on the second ring and put the phone on speaker after Evan asked whether Caleb was with her. "We interviewed Vickers again this morning," he said. His voice remained controlled, but Caleb heard the difference immediately. His account has changed. Roy's original explanation had been simple. Henry had asked him to stop by and look at a vehicle problem. According to Roy, he crouched near the driver's side because Henry mentioned a vibration and possible brake noise. He claimed the visit had been ordinary and insisted he never touched anything dangerous. Investigators then confronted him with the maintenance sheet marked Bennett Pressure Adjustment, Caldwell cash vouchers issued to Roy during the same week, Henry's recent brake service invoice from Henderson Auto and Brake, and enlarged copies of the trail camera images. Roy changed details. First, he said the payment was for unrelated work. Then he could not explain why no corresponding Caldwell vehicle appeared on his work schedule. Finally, investigators showed him records suggesting the cash payment had been authorized outside the normal maintenance system. Roy asked for a private conference with Martin Sloan. When the interview resumed, he began talking. According to Evan, Roy admitted that a senior Caldwell manager had told him Henry needed a lesson. Henry's investigation into Pine Hollow Bridge was creating problems, and he needed to become frightened enough to back away. Roy was instructed to make Henry's pickup unreliable without causing obvious damage. Roy said he interfered with the hydraulic brake line near the front driver's side, creating a weakness he expected would cause pressure loss gradually rather than immediate failure. He claims he believed Henry would notice the brake problem before anything serious happened, Evan said. Ruth's face had gone completely still. Caleb asked, "Does he admit knowing Henry drove mountain roads?" "Yes." "And he still touched the brake line?" "Yes." Ruth closed her eyes. Roy told investigators that when he heard Henry had gone through a guardrail several days later, he understood immediately what might have happened. He considered coming forward. Then someone from Caldwell told him to say nothing and reminded him that there was no proof he had ever touched the truck. Roy kept quiet. For 12 years. Ruth rose slowly from her chair and walked to the kitchen window. Ranger stood and followed, resting his shoulder against her leg. "He knew," she said. Evan did not try to make the admission smaller. "Yes." "Henry died, and he knew." "Yes." Caleb remained seated. Anger pushed against his ribs, but experience had taught him that anger was not evidence either. "Who told Roy to do it?" There was a pause on the phone. Ruth turned from the window. Evan answered carefully. "He hasn't put the name on the record yet." "Why not?" Ruth asked. "Because Vickers and his attorney are asking for a cooperation agreement before he identifies the person who gave the order and provides everything he says he knows." Caleb looked at Ruth. For months they had been working backward through papers, photographs, frightened witnesses, and 12 years of silence. Now, somewhere inside an interview room in Montana, Roy Vickers knew the name of the person who had set Henry Bennett's death in motion. And he was finally willing to say it. But only for a price. By late June 2026, nearly 5 months had passed since the blizzard that brought Caleb Morgan and Ranger to Ruth Bennett's door, and Silver Creek, Montana looked almost like a different town. The mountains that had once disappeared beneath walls of blowing snow were green along their lower slopes now, with patches of white lingering only in the highest shadows. Wild grass had returned beside Bennett Road, Pine Hollow Creek ran fast with snowmelt, and Ruth's old apple tree had begun producing small green fruit. Yet the investigation into Henry Bennett's death had only grown heavier. Roy Vickers' cooperation agreement had been finalized under the supervision of Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Hale, a 49-year-old prosecutor with shoulder-length dark blonde hair, sharp gray eyes, and a reputation for refusing both dramatic promises and convenient shortcuts. Hale had spent more than 20 years handling public corruption and financial conspiracy cases, and she had learned early in her career that a witness asking for leniency was useful only when his story could be independently proven. Roy finally placed the name of the man who had approached him into a formal recorded statement. It was not Dean Caldwell directly. According to Roy, the order had come through Gordon Pike, Caldwell Timber's former vice president of operations, a broad, heavy-set executive in his late 50s at the time who had controlled trucking schedules, maintenance budgets, and much of the day-to-day pressure surrounding Pine Hollow Bridge. Gordon had died of cancer 4 years earlier, meaning investigators could never question him. But Roy claimed Gordon had told him Henry needed to be frightened into abandoning his investigation and had authorized the cash payment for the work on Henry's pickup. That did not automatically make Dean Caldwell criminally responsible. Investigators needed to establish whether Gordon acted alone or carried instructions from higher up. The records began forming a chain. Financial analysts found cash withdrawals from a Caldwell Timber operating account that matched the week Roy received his unexplained payment. Archived phone records showed repeated calls between Gordon Pike and Dean Caldwell during the 48 hours before Roy appeared on Henry's trail camera. Corporate meeting notes placed both men together the afternoon after Henry refused to sign the revised bridge report. Elaine Porter's saved emails showed that Dean had personally asked senior staff to prevent Henry's documentation from reaching state transportation officials until the company could contain the exposure. The restored recording from Henry's locker captured Dean warning him that he would lose more than his job if he kept pushing. Individually, none of those facts proved Dean ordered sabotage. Together, they gave investigators enough to formally expand the case. Dean Caldwell, now 63, appeared for questioning with 2 attorneys. He remained physically impressive despite his age, tall and straight-backed, with silver hair combed neatly away from a tanned face, expensive Western boots, and the practiced calm of a businessman who had spent decades shaking hands at charity dinners and county meetings. He denied knowing about any plan to interfere with Henry's truck. He admitted pressuring Henry to resolve the bridge dispute, but claimed his words had referred only to lawsuits, employment consequences, and reputational damage. He described Gordon Pike as an aggressive manager who sometimes acted without approval. When investigators asked whether he had instructed Gordon to frighten Henry, Dean answered, no. When they asked why the company paid Roy outside its normal maintenance process, Dean said he did not remember. Rebecca Hale did not announce victory. She did not order reporters to gather outside the courthouse. She simply continued building the case. A courtroom is where guilt gets decided, she told Ruth during one carefully worded call. But there are things we can establish before that. Those things mattered more to Ruth than any headline about Dean Caldwell ever could. The original Pine Hollow Bridge file had finally been examined by a forensic document specialist using the actual paper, ink, pressure patterns, and comparison signatures from Henry's personnel records. The conclusion was clear enough for the state review. The signature approving continued full-load logging traffic was not consistent with Henry Bennett's authenticated signatures and showed indicators of simulation. Investigators also confirmed that Henry's carbon copy had been created before the official version entered the county archive. Several document revisions had occurred after his inspection. Frank Dorsey's testimony supported that the company knew Henry had refused approval. On June 24, Ruth received a formal letter stating that the state no longer considered Henry responsible for approving unsafe operations at Pine Hollow Bridge. The findings that had destroyed his professional reputation in 2014 were withdrawn. A separate notice followed regarding the crash. The old classification of a simple loss of control accident was no longer supportable in light of Roy's admission that he intentionally interfered with the pickup's hydraulic brake system shortly before Henry's death. The case was reclassified for continuing criminal investigation. The letter did not say murder. It did not say Dean Caldwell killed Henry. It said something Ruth had waited 12 years to hear. Henry's death could no longer reasonably be treated as an ordinary accident. The Silver Creek Chronicle had placed Henry Bennett's face on its front page 12 years earlier, beneath words like bribery and safety failure. On the morning of June 26th, the newspaper printed his photograph again. This time the headline read, "Henry Bennett cleared in 2014 bridge scandal." Ruth bought one copy at Miller's Market, then another, though she could not have explained why she needed two. She stood beside the produce section holding the paper while people slowly realized who she was. Reactions came in uncomfortable waves. Some approached her immediately. Others suddenly became fascinated by cereal boxes or canned soup. A few offered versions of the same sentence. I always wondered if there was more to it. Ruth knew some of them had wondered only after the truth became safe to believe. She did not correct them. Near the checkout counter, Walter Haynes, 78, a retired equipment operator with a stooped back, white eyebrows, and hands swollen by arthritis, stopped in front of her. Walter had once worked county road crews beside Henry. 12 years earlier, angry after reading the original newspaper reports, he had called Henry a crooked inspector, loudly enough for Ruth to hear outside the hardware store. Now Walter removed his baseball cap. "Ruth, I said things about Henry I had no right to say." His eyes dropped to the floor. "I believed what I was handed because it was easier than asking whether it made sense. I'm sorry." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She could have repeated every cruel word. She had not forgotten any of them. Instead, she folded the newspaper beneath one arm. "Henry doesn't need you to feel ashamed, Walter." He raised his eyes. "Then what does he need?" Ruth glanced at the headline. "He needs the truth put back where the lie used to be." Walter nodded, replaced his cap, and walked away with tears gathering in his eyes. Silver Creek Volunteer Fire voted unanimously the following week to restore Henry Bennett's name to the honor board in the old station. Chief Samuel Keene called Ruth personally. Years earlier, after the scandal, Henry's name had quietly been removed from the list of longtime volunteers during a renovation. No formal vote had ever condemned him. Somebody had simply decided his name brought uncomfortable questions. Keene's voice carried embarrassment when he explained it. "We should have had more courage back then." Ruth answered, "Then have it now." A fresh brass plate bearing Henry Bennett, 26 years of service, was installed beneath the old department emblem. Ruth visited alone first. She ran 2 fingers over Henry's name, then stood before locker F-17. 5 months earlier, that locker had opened the first door in a mystery. Now Ruth realized. Proof could repair a reputation, but it could not repair every relationship the lie had damaged. There was still one person missing from her life. Daniel. Her son had been 47 for almost 6 months now. Ruth knew his birthday because she had mailed him a card, as she did every year. He had sent a short text back. "Thank you, Mom. Love you." They had spoken twice since winter, both calls careful, polite, and brief. Ruth had not told him every detail of the investigation because she wanted to wait until she could say something certain. Now she had certainty. She still could not make the call. Caleb found her late that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone placed beside a folded copy of the Chronicle. Ranger had arrived with him and immediately wandered into the kitchen, as comfortably as if the cabin belonged partly to him now. The German shepherd sniffed beneath the table, discovered nothing edible, then settled beside Ruth's chair. Caleb poured himself coffee without asking. Ruth did not object, which he considered progress. He looked at the phone. "You planning to stare it into ringing?" Ruth gave him a tired look. "I'm thinking." "You've been thinking since I got here." "That's because some of us think before we speak." Caleb accepted the insult and sat opposite her. After a while he asked, "What are you afraid of?" Ruth's fingers tightened around the edge of the newspaper. She had faced investigators. She had listened to the recording of Dean Caldwell threatening Henry. She had walked into a town that once whispered behind her back and watched people apologize. Yet this frightened her more. "That he'll answer." Caleb understood immediately. If Daniel ignored the call, Ruth could keep imagining a reconciliation. If he answered, 12 years of grief would have nowhere left to hide. Hope could be cruel that way. Loneliness became familiar. Hope demanded movement. Ranger shifted beneath the table and rested his chin on Ruth's slipper. She looked down at him. "You two caused an awful lot of trouble for a pair I found half frozen in January." Caleb smiled. "Technically, he found you." Ruth almost smiled back. She picked up the phone and dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Caleb looked toward the window to give her what privacy he could without leaving. On the 4th ring, a man answered. "Hello?" Ruth closed her eyes. "Daniel?" Silence. Then his voice changed. "Mom?" Daniel Bennett was 47 now, living near Eugene, Oregon, where he worked as a building contractor. He had inherited Henry's broad shoulders and practical hands, but Ruth's hazel eyes, and age had threaded gray through his dark brown hair at the temples. Friends described him as reliable and generous, but grief had made him cautious whenever conversations moved toward Silver Creek. Ruth had spent years hearing only fragments of the boy he once was beneath the careful adult voice. She did not begin with Roy. She did not begin with Caldwell. She did not even mention the reopened investigation. "Your father was cleared," she said. Nothing came through the phone except Daniel's breathing. Ruth continued. "He never signed the bridge approval, they confirmed it, and the police no longer believe his crash was simply an accident." Daniel made a broken sound and then went quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was unsteady. "I told him to stop." Ruth's eyes filled. "Daniel, the last thing I said to Dad was to let it go." He inhaled shakily. "I told him to choose you. I spent 12 years wondering if he died trying to prove the very thing I told him wasn't worth destroying the family over." Ruth pressed the phone harder against her ear. "Your father never blamed you." Daniel cried openly now. "How can you know that?" Ruth turned toward Henry's photograph on the wall, the one she no longer hid behind a newspaper clipping. Henry stood there in his volunteer fire jacket, with the same steady eyes she remembered from 43 years of marriage. "Because I knew the man I married." A long silence followed. Caleb did not move. Ranger remained against Ruth's feet. Finally, Daniel spoke again, very quietly. "Mom?" "Yes." "Can I come home?" Ruth looked across the kitchen. For years, that table had held one plate, one coffee cup, one pair of hands. She remembered Daniel at 8 years old spilling milk across it, Henry teaching him to carve his first piece of pine there, arguments, birthdays, Christmas dinners, and the terrible silence that followed Henry's death. Ruth swallowed. "Daniel, that door was never locked to you." By early October 2026, more than 8 months had passed since the blizzard brought Caleb, Morgan, and Ranger to the end of Bennett Road, and the criminal case surrounding Caldwell Timber was still moving through Montana's legal system. Attorneys argued over records, investigators continued tracing old payments, and Dean Caldwell's lawyers disputed almost every suggestion that he had known what Gordon Pike and Roy Vickers were doing 12 years earlier. Ruth Bennett had finally stopped measuring her days by whether the phone rang with another update. Henry's name had been cleared. His death was no longer classified as an ordinary accident. Whatever happened in court would matter, but Ruth had come to understand that she did not have to postpone the rest of her life until a judge or jury placed the final period at the end of the story. On a cold Saturday morning, Silver Creek Volunteer Fire held a small ceremony at the old station. There were no television crews and no politicians standing behind microphones. Chief Samuel Keene spoke for less than 5 minutes before unveiling the restored brass plate on the department honor board. Henry Bennett, 26 years of service. Beneath it, on a smaller plaque chosen by the volunteers themselves, were the words, "He chose the truth when silence would have been easier." Ruth stood in the front row, wearing a dark blue coat and the pearl earrings Henry had given her for their 30th anniversary. She did not cry when the cloth came away from the plaque. She simply touched Henry's name with 2 fingers and whispered, "There you are." Caleb stood several steps behind her, with Ranger sitting calmly at his left side. The German shepherd glanced toward the crowd whenever someone moved, but the old constant tension was gone from his shoulders. He was alert because he was a working dog, not because he believed disaster was waiting behind every sound. Daniel Bennett arrived in Silver Creek that same afternoon. He drove from Oregon with his wife, Rachel Bennett, a 45-year-old elementary school counselor with warm brown eyes, shoulder-length auburn hair, and the gentle habit of listening fully before offering advice. Rachel had spent years trying to help Daniel talk about his parents without pushing him toward a reconciliation he was not ready to attempt. Their 10-year-old daughter, Ellie, stepped out of the SUV wearing a purple winter hat despite the mild afternoon. She was small for her age, with Daniel's hazel eyes, a spray of freckles across her nose, and the fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that adults often preferred certain questions to remain unasked. Ruth waited on the porch. Daniel stopped beside the vehicle. For several seconds, neither mother nor son moved. 12 years could not be crossed with one dramatic embrace. Daniel had gray beginning at his temples now. Ruth noticed it before anything else. She remembered cutting that same dark hair over the kitchen sink when he was 6. "You got old," she said. Daniel laughed once through tears. "You too, Mom." Then they hugged. It was awkward at first, 2 people remembering a shape that had once been natural. Ruth held on longer than Daniel expected. Daniel held on longer than Ruth expected. Their reconciliation did not become perfect simply because the truth had changed. The first dinner contained long silences. Daniel apologized too often. Ruth occasionally answered too sharply. When Daniel said he should have come home sooner, Ruth told him, "Yes, you should have," instead of offering the easy forgiveness he expected. Then she reached across the table and put another potato on his plate. That was how they began. Not with 12 years erased, but with ordinary things allowed to exist beside them. The next morning, Daniel walked Bennett Road with Ruth, while Rachel and Ellie remained at the house making pancakes. They argued gently about whether Ruth should still climb ladders. That afternoon, Daniel repaired 2 damaged sections of Henry's workshop roof. He used Henry's old carpenter square, found exactly where his father had carved HB into the wooden handle, and sat on the ladder for several minutes before continuing. Ellie followed Ruth through the workshop, asking about every tool. Finally, she pointed toward Henry's photograph on the wall. "What was Grandpa like before all the bad stuff happened?" Ruth froze. For 12 years, almost every story about Henry had begun with the scandal. What they accused him of, what he tried to prove, how he died. Ruth looked at her granddaughter and realized Ellie had asked a far more important question. So Ruth told her about a man who could build a bookshelf perfectly straight, but somehow hang every picture frame slightly crooked. She told her Henry sang old country songs while washing dishes and never remembered the correct lyrics. She told her he once spent an entire Sunday repairing a little red wagon for a neighborhood boy because the child had cried when one wheel fell off. Ellie laughed when Ruth described Henry hiding chocolate in the garage because his doctor had told him to cut back on sugar. For the first time in 12 years, Henry Bennett became a husband, father, carpenter, volunteer firefighter, and ridiculous singer before he became a victim. Ruth noticed Daniel listening from the workshop doorway. He did not interrupt, he only smiled. While the Bennett family learned how to begin again, Caleb and Ranger continued their own return. Dr. Melissa Grant approved Ranger for limited operational work late that autumn, beginning with controlled searches under experienced supervision. Caleb received his medical and psychological clearance with similar conditions. Neither clearance pretended the avalanche had never happened. Caleb would continue counseling. Ranger would continue periodic behavioral evaluations. Their recovery was not a certificate declaring them cured. It was permission to move forward, responsibly. Their first real call came in early December, after a 17-year-old boy named Noah Grayson failed to return from a snowshoe trip in the mountains north of Bozeman. Noah was a high school senior, lean and athletic, with sandy blonde hair and a reputation among his teachers for being responsible enough that his parents knew something had gone wrong when darkness arrived without him. A helicopter carried Caleb, Ranger, and 2 other SAR members toward the search sector shortly after sunrise. As the aircraft approached the ridge, Caleb saw wind dragging loose snow across the slope in silver streams. His stomach tightened. Ranger's ears flattened. The terrain was not the same mountain where Mason died, but memory did not care much about geography. When the helicopter touched down, Ranger jumped into the snow and then stopped. A gust rushed through the pines. Somewhere above them, snow shifted from a branch with a soft rushing sound. Ranger turned toward Caleb. For an instant, Caleb saw the dog from 7 weeks after Mason's death, frozen between instinct and memory. Caleb felt his own pulse climbing. Mason's shout seemed close enough to hear. He could almost see the wall of white again. Caleb did not say, "Don't be afraid." Fear was already there, and lying about it would not help either of them. He crouched beside Ranger and rested one gloved hand briefly against the dog's shoulder. "We go together." Ranger held his gaze. Then his nose lowered to the snow. He moved forward. The search lasted nearly 2 hours. Ranger followed fragments of scent across a wooded drainage, lost them where wind had stripped the ridge bare, then circled downhill without waiting for Caleb to correct him. 20 minutes later, he stopped beside a cluster of low pines and barked. Caleb pushed through the branches and found Noah lying against a fallen log, his right ankle badly swollen and one glove missing. He was cold, frightened, and exhausted, but conscious. "My parents are going to kill me," the teenager whispered when Caleb reached him. Caleb checked his condition and smiled. "Good news. That means you expect to get home." Noah laughed weakly. Ranger moved close enough for the boy to touch his fur. Rescue personnel arrived soon afterward and carried Noah toward the extraction point. When the helicopter disappeared with him, Caleb remained on the slope with Ranger for several seconds. He knelt in the snow and put both hands against the German shepherd's neck. "Good job, buddy." Ranger leaned into him. Caleb looked toward the mountains. Mason was still dead. Nothing about finding Noah changed that. But Caleb finally understood that continuing the work was not leaving Mason behind. It was carrying forward what Mason had believed the work was for. Ranger did not need to become the dog he had been before the avalanche. Caleb did not need to become the man he had been either. They only had to become two survivors, capable of living honestly with what remained. 1 year after the blizzard, winter returned to Silver Creek quietly. There was no emergency warning that morning, no closed highway, no truck buried against a pine tree. Snow fell gently from a gray January sky as Caleb loaded an overnight bag into the Ford and opened the passenger door. "Want to visit an old friend?" Ranger was inside before Caleb finished the question. As they turned onto Bennett Road, Ranger stood and stared through the windshield. The cabin appeared between the pines. Before Caleb had fully parked, Ranger was waiting at the door. Caleb released him. The German shepherd bounded across the yard, climbed the porch steps, and struck the front door with his paw. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The door opened. Ruth stood there, wearing the same blue cardigan she had worn during many of those first winter mornings. "3 scratches again?" Ranger's tail swept from side to side. "You could learn to knock like everyone else." He pushed his nose against her hand. Caleb stepped inside and heard Daniel laughing in the kitchen. Daniel and Rachel had begun visiting every few months, and Ellie now considered Bennett Road one of her favorite places because Ruth allowed dessert before dinner whenever her parents were not looking. Ellie was placing an apple pie on the table and immediately abandoned the task when she saw Ranger. "You came!" Ranger accepted the greeting with great dignity until he noticed a faded tennis ball near the fireplace. Caleb looked toward the wall. Henry's photograph hung in the center now. The old newspaper clipping was gone. Henry was not displayed as a victim of Caldwell timber, or even as the man Silver Creek had finally cleared. He was simply Henry Bennett, silver-haired and smiling, one hand resting on Ruth's shoulder. Ranger settled beneath the photograph. Ruth looked toward the dining table. Years earlier, she had sometimes set 2 places long after Henry died, because 43 years of marriage had taught her hands a routine grief could not immediately erase. Eventually, she stopped. Tonight there were places for Ruth, Daniel, Rachel, Ellie, and Caleb, with Ranger already positioned beneath the table in the scientifically perfect location for intercepting dropped meat. Caleb caught him staring at Daniel's plate. "Don't even think about it." Ranger looked away with the innocence of a career criminal. Ruth laughed. Caleb turned toward her. "Did you ever think that night would lead to all this?" Ruth looked at Ranger and remembered the half-frozen German shepherd standing alone on her porch 1 year earlier. Blood on his leg, snow covering his back, asking a stranger to follow him into darkness. "No," she said. Then she smiled. "I only thought somebody needed help." Outside, snow began falling more steadily. Wind moved softly through the pine trees. Ranger's ears lifted at the sound. A year earlier, that sound would have brought him to his feet. Now he listened for a moment, lowered his head onto Caleb's boot, and closed his eyes. Ruth looked around the table and understood something that had taken 12 years, 1 blizzard, 1 wounded Marine, and 1 stubborn German shepherd to teach her. She had gone into the storm believing she was rescuing Caleb and Ranger. Ranger had led her to Caleb. Caleb had helped lead her back toward Henry's truth. Ruth had given Caleb and Ranger a quiet place where fear did not have to disappear before they could begin healing. Daniel had returned not because the past could be repaired, but because love still had somewhere to go after regret. No one at that table had saved anyone alone. Love, Ruth had learned, was not always holding on. Sometimes it was opening a door. Sometimes it was letting someone leave without deciding they were gone forever. Sometimes it was carrying the memory of the dead without turning their memory into a prison for the living. And sometimes a family did not begin with blood at all. Sometimes it began with 3 scratches on a door in the middle of a blizzard. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder from the sky or answers we can immediately understand. Sometimes God sends them quietly through a stranger who opens a door, a wounded dog that refuses to give up, or a second chance that appears when we have almost stopped believing one will come. Ruth thought she was saving Caleb and Ranger that night in the snow, but in the end, they helped save something inside her too. They helped bring the truth about Henry back into the light, and reminded her that grief does not have to become the place where life ends. Caleb learned that honoring the people we lose does not mean carrying guilt forever. Ranger learned that fear can remain in the heart without controlling every step. And Ruth learned that even after years of loneliness, love can still find its way back home. The same lesson belongs in our everyday lives. There may be someone around you carrying pain you cannot see, a neighbor who needs a conversation, a family member waiting for forgiveness, an animal that only needs one safe place to rest, a person who has been judged by a story that was never completely true. Never underestimate what God can do through one small act of kindness. You may believe you are simply opening a door for someone else, only to discover that God was also opening a door for you. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of Ruth, Caleb, and Ranger's journey stayed with you the most. And if you believe in kindness, loyalty, second chances, and the quiet miracles God places along our path, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories like this. May God bless you and your family. May He give you strength when life feels heavy, peace when the road ahead is uncertain, courage to forgive what has hurt you, and loving people who will stand beside you through every storm. And if you believe that God can still turn pain into purpose and bring light out of the darkest seasons of life, comment Amen below. God bless you, and thank you for watching.